Hello and welcome to this eCampus News webinar on scheduling for a complex workforce. My name is Dennis Pierce and I'll be moderating this event. I'm the former editor of eCampus News. I'm now a freelance education writer and consultant, and I'm excited to have you join us for what should be a very informative session. Today's webinar is sponsored by Kronos for Higher Education, whose automated workforce solutions help you manage professional, union, auxiliary, and student employees at the same time. Before I introduce our presenters, I'd like to go over some features of the platform that we'll be using for this webinar. Today's event will be recorded, so you don't have to worry about missing anything. Within a few days, you'll receive an email message that contains a link to the recorded webinar along with a PDF of the slides. You can submit questions at any time during the presentation by clicking on the purple Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, typing your question into the pop-up box, and hitting Submit. We'll save those questions for a Q&A session with our presenters at the end of the webinar. We also have a group chat function that you can launch by clicking on the blue chat button at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to use this feature to chat among yourselves or to contact someone from the eCampus News team if you have a technical question. But please don't use this feature to ask questions of our speakers. If you have a question for the speakers, you should use the Q&A box that I just mentioned. If you find that you're having a hard time reading the text on the slides, you can enlarge that portion of your screen by clicking on the box in the upper right-hand corner of the slide window, or you can click on the double arrows for a full screen view of the slide presentation. And finally, we encourage you to join the back channel conversation on Twitter by referring to the Twitter handle @Kronos and the hashtag ECNWebinar in your tweets. So with these logistical items out of the way, let's go ahead and meet our presenters. Dennis Miller is Chief Employment Officer for the Cal Poly Pomona Foundation, which oversees auxiliary services for the university. He has extensive HR experience in both higher education and the for-profit sector. Before joining Cal Poly Pomona Foundation, he served as Director of Human Resources for California State University Fresno Auxiliary Corporation. He's also a former Vice President of Human Resources for Investors Business Daily and for the IT outsourcing firm Systems Management Specialist. Chris Mullen is Director of Strategic Advisory for Kronos. A thought leader on performance, development, and talent strategies, Chris has 15 years of experience as an HR practitioner focused on maximizing engagement. Before joining Kronos, he was the HR Director for Housing and Dining Services at the University of Colorado Boulder and the Assistant Director for Recruitment and Selection at Colorado State University's Office of Equal Opportunity. Both Dennis and Chris are certified as senior professionals in human resources through the Human Resources Certification Institute. I'll be leading a conversation with them about scheduling for complex workforce environments such as campus dining, housing, and security, and then they'll take questions from the audience at the end. So gentlemen, welcome to you both. I'd like to begin by thank you. I'd like to begin by asking you what makes these campus workforce environments so challenging to schedule for? Dennis, maybe you could take this question first.
Well, thank you, Dennis and Chris. I'm happy to be here today. Our particular environment has a campus of about 25,000 students, and we use student labor as really our primary workforce. So we employ about 1,600 students a year. With the services we provide. We provide dining services, housing, bookstore, we have a hotel and a conference center, we have catering, and probably a few other things as well. And students, when it comes to scheduling, it's really a fascinating challenge because right at the forefront of that discussion is an acknowledgement that the reason that students are here on campus is to go to school. That's why they're here. They're not here to have a job. And understanding that cornerstone is exceptionally important because everything flows from that whole perspective. So what do students have? Students have a priority of going to school, and yet many of them want to work. And their class schedules come first. And classes on a campus don't normally flow 8 to 5. You know, a student may have a course from 8 to 10, and they may not have another course until 3 to 5, and that might be on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and then on Mondays and Wednesdays they may have a course from 1 to 4, and maybe a lab from 4 to 5. So all those different schedules now apply to the workforce, and how does a manager take the availability of any given student and plug them into a schedule in a particular venue that may be open from 6 a.m. to midnight? On this campus, we have about 30 different dining venues, and we have things like Starbucks and Subway and Denny's and Jamba, and we have a residential dining function. We also have a catering function, which provides catering both on-site and off-site. Catering is really a fascinating area because you don't really know in advance from week to week or month to month if you're going to have big or small catering functions. So to be able to offer schedules on the fly, and in order for those schedules to meet student workers, is really quite the challenge. So if you just think about a normal workday, let's just say the board operation, the residential dining, where they may be open from 6 a.m. to midnight, that particular function, you may need 6, 8, 10, 12 different workers in one full workday to cover all the hours needed throughout that day. And students sometimes call in with short notice because they're either sick or maybe they have to study for a midterm exam. They have to place more priority on their schoolwork than work. So you have all those variables that absolutely impact the scheduling process. The other variable that we have is students can only work a maximum of 20 hours a week. And that's both a policy issue, and it's kind of a practical issue as well, because let's face it, students are here to learn, expand their knowledge, and of course to get good grades. So there is a limit on the number of hours they can be scheduled to begin with. So having a tool to accommodate that, or several tools, is really, really important. Otherwise, it's really a lot of hard work. And those are the things that from our perspective, are probably the most challenging for dining. It's not quite as challenging in our housing services. Housing doesn't have that the same level of variability with the different venues. But there is a lot of complexity in the housing area because of the hours they work and the way that they perform their work with servicing other student residents who actually live in the university housing sponsored apartments, if you will. So those are probably the biggest areas of concern that we have. Chris, what are your thoughts?
Well, thanks, Dennis. I love how you took the student perspective first, because I think that's first and foremost, right? That's the foundation of why a university, college campus exists. I think for me, and actually, I've been in higher education prior to my job at Kronos for over 18 years. I have worked in dining, in housing. I've been in RA, so I've seen this firsthand from a student perspective. But then I've also, as I've quote unquote grown up in my career, in residence life and in HR, I have also seen it from I think a bigger perspective as well. I've seen it grow. I've seen the challenges change over the years. But one thing that I have been finding, Dennis, and I wonder if you find the same thing, is my number one challenge, whether I was a student or working on the administrative side of things, it's difficult to fill a lot of these positions. I think for all the reasons you said, right? It's a lot about the student employee, but even when you talk about non-student employees, it's hard to fill those positions too, because in housing, dining, security, at a lot of campuses, these are some of our lower paying positions. We just need to be real with that. That's where it falls with the campus. And so they're really difficult to fill. So that's probably my number one challenge. And with that, even if you do fill the position, there's a lot of turnover and churn, whether it's your full-time, your part-time, and students, for the very reasons that you said, Dennis, the idea that it may not fit with a student's schedule anymore, and so they quit. Or what the term now is ghosting. They don't even show up. So when they get hired for a job, they don't even show up on day one, and you've been ghosted. So there's some of the newer terms that are being used, but and that kind of that challenge goes to the economy. Where our economy is right now, at least for the full-time and part-time workers, a lot of times, at least the places I've worked, are the college campuses are in a more affluent town or county, and those individuals working in dining could go to a restaurant and make more money per hour. So it's this idea of the economy and then the pipeline. What kind of a pipeline do you have where you're trying to fill these positions? And from my experience, it is difficult, and I don't think there's a lot of intentionality behind filling your pipeline. Where is it coming from? Years of recession, universities thrive because employees, potential workers, want benefits. They want security. In times where the economy is doing well, that's less likely. And so people have choices now, and universities and I think college campuses need to become a place of choice to work. They have built-in workers with their students, but they don't have built-in workers for full-time and part-time. And so universities need to, housing, dining, security, they need to consider pay. Are they paying, the market rate? Can they pay the market rate? If they can't, what other benefits could they give them? I know I spend a lot of time on the front lines talking with employees, being a director of HR, and I know from my conversations, a lot of frontline employees would give up their benefits for more money because they're looking to pay for their rent and other things. And I also believe that housing, dining, security, we depend, as Dennis, as you said, we depend a lot on student employees, and a lot of times. How do we really make the schedules fit their lifestyle, right? This lifestyle where they need to be flexible, their academics are their number one priority, and right, that's the number one priority for housing, dining in the university is the students' academics. And then the other big challenge that I see, the second thing is, as you try to fill these positions, it's getting enough skilled workers. Right, Dennis, so you could probably rattle off the top of your head the different skills, the knife cutting skills for chefs and sous chefs, CPR. There are a lot of different skill sets, and then with the security as well, there's a lot of different skill sets that are needed for a lot of these jobs, and maybe not a lot of the workers out who are unemployed have those skill sets. So that comes back to the pipeline. Are universities building that pipeline and that skill set through their workers? When I was working director of HR, we talked a lot about the dining workers as our entry-level workers, the ones who ran the lines, things like that. But are we also giving them the chance and the skill set to upgrade their skills to maybe even become a cook or a chef? Are we allowing that? Because that helps build your pipeline. And from the places that I've worked, the culture of the dining workers were very familial. So if they came to workforce and had a good experience, their cousin, their brother, their uncle would also come, their sister, we would have a lot of influx of family members, which is a great pipeline to have. And so, but are you giving them those skills, the computer literacy, sometimes even English as a second language? There's a lot of different things that could be taken into account to help build your pipeline. And I think universities and colleges need to take that into consideration.
Yeah, that's a great point. I want to jump in and just ask, because universities and colleges are using so many student workers, and because student employees' schedules can change quite frequently, right? Because they might be adding or dropping classes, they might be starting or ending different activities throughout the course of a semester. I would imagine that creates a challenge for managers just to sort of keep track of what everybody's availability is at any given time as well.
Yeah, I think you're right on from the idea of how are managers really going about staffing adequately. I think it has a major impact not only on the manager's job, but on the department, the division as a whole. From that sense, right? Because if you're trying to manage the staff and you're trying to fill shifts, and you have less folks to fill the shifts, so you have open shifts that are happening in any one given day, the quality of work goes down, the increased risk of injury can go up, customer satisfaction can be impacted, and then you also have the consideration of the employees' burnout and stress, and students don't want that in their job, right? They have enough stress and burnout from their academics. and from learning. So it's a major impact, and that goes for security, the security department as well. If you don't have someone come in, or it's hard to fill those shifts, that's a risk for the university that could possibly be happening. And then we have to take in consideration, if these shifts are open, do we have to shut down for dining, for instance, if there's not enough dining workers in the dining halls I've worked at, which are fairly large, probably not as large as Dennis's, but there were different stations. Italian, Mexican, even kosher. But if there weren't enough workers, you would have to start to shut down some of those sections and some of those lines. And that really, and if it's a smaller institution, you might have to it might impact the whole dining operation as a whole. And that really starts to talk about the student needs. Now we're really impacting students. And our first goal should be to take care of the students while they're attending school. And this kind of goes into Maslow's hierarchy of needs, at least the first two levels of Maslow when we talk about the psychological impact and then the safety piece. And so I know universities know that theory, but it really starts to impact the students. Dennis, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, Chris, you've articulated it quite well. I think there are a couple of things that I would add that we've experienced here. And oftentimes at campuses, certainly it's true in our environment, the functions we have, like dining, etc., bookstore, they're required to be self-supporting. So we don't get money from the general fund from the state of California. The only funds that we get are from sales of sandwiches at Subway and food, etc. So when they're missing people from the Subway line, it certainly slows down the line. And of course, at the customer level, at the student, which is mainly students, they run a very tight schedule between classes to grab a bite to eat. So 5 or 10 minutes actually makes a big difference to them. And of course, they can't really go to their car, drive off campus, and get back in time. That's not even a real option. So at the very basic level, it impacts their ability to sustain their mindset and to eat and all that. Even at a more fundamental level, when students, or anybody, quite frankly, when they give short notice, they call in sick, in many cases the supervisor expects that student to find a replacement worker. And we can debate whether or not that's a good idea all day long, but that's the reality, at least on our campus. And that's tough, because if a student can't work to begin with, it's certainly difficult for them to reach out to one of their buddies and say, hey, can you fill this schedule for me? I can't quite make it. So those things they're quite real. And going back to the first part of the discussion, if the operations aren't selling, even if they're producing meals, and they're producing food, they're consuming food supplies, and they're preparing, just like you talked about, Chris, they're preparing for that kosher line or that Mexican line, and it's staffed with 2 or 3 people, and 1 or 2 of those people don't show up and they have to close that line down, well, that operation has still expended those funds on food. And if the food division is going to remain sustainable over time, you can't have a whole lot of waste. And that produces waste that hits the bottom line directly. And most people understand that food services everywhere on the planet is a type of function that has very low profit margins. So there's not a lot of waste there. There's not a lot of opportunity to consume food and not get a return on the investment from an operational standpoint. And that's for us, that's something that we're always trying to be concerned about. So it's really a delicate balancing act when you talk about scheduling, when you talk about short notices, call outs, and you can't really create a bench of people, not easily, and say, well, I'm supposed to be at my shift at noon, I'm going to call out at 11:30. Many of the students that are calling out, they're all calling out because they all have the same class, the same finals, and so on and so forth. So it's really an interesting dynamic on a campus environment to figure out how to fill those needs. It's just very interesting.
And Dennis, super complex, right? I mean, not only are you looking at all the student schedules, but the managers are spending most of their time doing that and trying to fill the positions. I know that was my experience as well. And it really becomes even more difficult.
Yes, I would agree completely, Chris. We experience the same thing. Our managers probably spend more time scheduling and adjusting the schedule because remember, the schedule is usually created at the beginning of the semester at a
Yep.
point in time when students believe they're going to get this course or that course and may or may not have been confirmed for that course. So then their schedule changes a week after school starts, and now they have a work schedule that's already been kind of etched in stone. So it's really a tough environment from that perspective.
Yeah.
You both touched on
and then we didn't. Oh, sorry, Dennis. I just wanted to say, and then not only the churn of the semester, but you have the churn of the year. I know for our student workers, if I were hiring 1,200 a year, that we would churn over close to 1,000, and so you lose all that knowledge, and you have to retrain everybody every year, which adds to the complexity.
Yeah, you both touched on the implications of not being able to fill shifts when workers call out or don't show up. I want to segue into what that impact that has on the university and the student experience, the larger experience of students. And on this slide, the first quote you see comes from a report published by the National Post-Secondary Education Cooperative, which analyzed years of research and concluded basically what common sense tells us, that a student's satisfaction with his or her college experience can affect that student's academic achievement. Simply put, if students have a positive experience on campus, for example, if they feel safe, if their housing needs are well attended to, if they don't have to wait in long lines to get a meal, then they're more likely to feel connected with their college or university. And what that means is they're more likely to be fully engaged in their education as well and to complete their program of study. And then that second quote comes from a story in the Chronicle of Higher Education, which reported a few years ago on a separate piece of research that found that changes to how colleges and universities were rated in terms of their students' quality of life in the annual college rankings that are published by the Princeton Review and by U.S. News and World Report can directly affect the number of applications that institution receives, as well as the competitiveness of its freshman classes. So in other words, how students perceive their campus experience can affect an institution's reputation, and this in turn can shape student enrollment in measurable ways. So obviously the experience that students have on campus is critical, and this includes not only their experience in their classrooms, but also in dorms, their dining halls, and other campus environments. Chris, do you have, and Dennis, did you have anything else you wanted to add in terms of the impact that failing to staff adequately can have on an institution, or do you feel like we covered that in that last conversation? Is there anything you wanted to add?
This is Dennis, and yes, there's one comment I'd like to add. In California, the California State University system, the public education system in California, which has about 500,000 students each year, and I believe it's the largest public institution in the United States, perhaps even in the world. One of the main challenges, one of the metrics actually that the system uses is graduation rates and how we can do better, how we can improve those rates. And they've done a lot of research on that particular area because we're in the business of course, providing learning, very thoughtful and detailed learning with some of the best faculty in the world. And yet the graduation rates aren't where we'd like for them to be. So one of the studies they've done is to figure out what the linkage is between exactly what you talked about in these other surveys, but even a deeper level, which is how does the experience on campus, especially when students work on campus, how does that correlate to their success as far as actually graduating in 4 years when they're trying to get a 4-year degree? Because that's an important metric. You know, if it takes 6 or 7 years to get a 4-year degree, which it often does in our system, and it's not any person's fault, it's just a statistical fact, how do we shorten that time span down to something that's closer to 4 years? And it goes directly to the student satisfaction of the campus as a whole. And if you can think about the complexity that Chris and I talked about with respect to scheduling students, and anything that detracts a student from their studies can and often does impact their graduation time period. You only need to get one bad grade to miss a course in an institution of higher education where 90% of the courses are impacted, meaning you can't get the course right away. So if you don't get a good grade and you have to repeat that course, it's not as easy as it sounds. And that delays your time for graduation, which, as you know, creates all kinds of other problems. So that's an additional layer that we examine here within our whole system, not just at our campus.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm with you on that one, Dennis. I wholeheartedly agree with these quotes and this research. The only degree I got on time was my master's degree. It took me 2 years. Otherwise, my 4-year took me 5, and my PhD, God, took me 9. And so I've lived this out, but it also is about the quality of life we provide. I think universities and colleges, whether it's from an HR perspective, from an administrative perspective, they need to think about the university as a business if they aren't already. And that's not just the bottom line, the profit and loss, but that's also your customers are your students, and what's their satisfaction rate? What are their ratings? Because there are plenty of sites out there where they can rate your university, they can rate your housing and dining operations, and that can deter others from going to your campus. It's not the same type of college it was, and with residence halls and dorms, it was 10, 20 years ago, right? That the amenities that are being offered from your competitors are vast. And so whether it's a suite style living or whether it's multiple dining halls with top-notch chefs, these are all things that people consider before choosing a university, not just the academic rigor of the university. And housing and dining plays a key role in the sense of belonging for a student. And coming, academics aside, I have seen it where a custodian has made such an impact in a resident's life who lives in a residence hall that it gave them that sense of belonging because they knew someone, and it kept them on campus through that crucial first year to then graduate in 4 years. And I probably preaching to the choir with the audience on this one, but with the way technology is, where you can rate everything now, they really colleges and universities, housing and dining, should be cognizant of those ratings and how to improve them with looking at focus groups from their students and their residents, and constantly going through that type of innovation.
Yeah, great points. So we've talked a lot about some of the challenges involved in scheduling for these complex workforce environments on campus, like housing and dining, and also the impact that this has on the overall student experience when services aren't adequately staffed. I'd like to shift the conversation now to solutions to these challenges and how an automated workforce management tool can help with these challenges. You both had experience in using an automated workforce system. How can this technology help with scheduling, and can you describe your experience both before using an automated solution and what that looked like, and also after? Dennis, maybe you could start.
Yes, in our environment, the scheduling process for many of the schedules, first, there's no one centralized schedule. Each of the 30 dining venues, for example, have their own schedule. So you have 30 different people scheduling for one dining operation. And by the way, many of the workers work in more than one food venue. So they may not work just in Taco Bell or Starbucks. They may work in 2 or 3 in order to get the hours that they'd like to get. And most of the time, the managers will have a spreadsheet. I've actually seen paper utilized to write down names, where they take the list of names and they post a schedule weekly on a bulletin board in the particular venue. Only, of course, for have the people call out, it changes 15 times. So as we talked about earlier, managers spend an inordinate amount of time just coordinating schedules. And of course, when the students don't show up, sometimes the supervisors want to punish the the worker. So there's a dimension there that we probably don't need to talk about, but that's also a real problem. So from an automation standpoint, having the ability, for example, to use an automated scheduler where the student can take ownership, or the worker, whoever it is, whether it's student, part-time, or full-time, mostly student workers in our environment, where if they're not going to be at a shift, they're going to call in late, or they're going to skip the shift altogether. Having a device, having a platform where they can say, hey, look, I'm not going to be at my workstation at noon. It's 11:15 now. I'm going to send out this note to all the other people who may have the requisite skills to fill this role and see if anybody wants it. And they can respond in real time. A system can be configured, by the way, that allows the supervisor to approve that change or basically put it on some sort of autopilot method where it's automatically approved, because at the end of the day, the store manager or the supervisor, they want a body in that position, a body that's qualified and ready and able to work, and they're not necessarily focused on exactly which person it is, because remember, they may schedule 10 or 15 people in one day or 30 in one day. So, moving people in and out of a 2 or 3 hour shift is not really a problematic thing as long as the person has the skills, of course. So having an automated way to do that where the manager can either approve it or let the workers simply approve it themselves, having that information automatically repopulate the scheduler and the timekeeper in a way that says, well, even though John was scheduled to work 3 hours, Mary's going to take that shift, so now the hours are taken off of John's schedule and put into Mary's time card, and she works it. And oh, by the way, the tool will also allow you to limit workers who actually receive a text message, if that's what it is, or an alert, so that anybody that receives that message hasn't already worked more than their 20 hours a week. It's a great feature. It's a great feature to have. So having those kind of tools available for scheduling are almost essential in our environment, and I'm really glad to see that they're really coming into play, in 2019 for sure. Very refreshing. Saves time for the workers, saves time for the managers.
Yeah, and Dennis, it mitigates risk and compliance issues, right? You start to go over those 20 hours, and you're audited. You've got some serious problems that could cost you even more money.
That's exactly right. And once you work those hours, you can't really undo it. So now you have a record that you've actually violated some rule somewhere. And as you stated, Chris, that's never a good idea. But it's an entirely different thought process. And managers have a real difficult time sometimes relinquishing any kind of control. But I think over time, I think that whole model will shift so that, again, assuming that you have people with the requisite skills to fill in shifts, there really shouldn't be a big deal on whether it's a John or a Mary that fills that shift. Not really.
And a lot of times the technology can check that skill set for you.
Exactly. That's exactly correct. It's, in fact, the alerts shouldn't go out to anyone who doesn't have the skill set. And as long as it's configured properly on the front end, you'll get really good results on the back end.
Yeah. And I'll piggyback off you there, Dennis. My experience scheduling prior to any sort of system, I think is similar to many. It's arduous. It's super painful. And I know we have on the webinar today administrators, campus leaders, and I would challenge each of you on this webinar, if you don't know how your dining or housing is scheduling, your custodians, your facilities, how you're scheduling your employees, I challenge you to reach out to those folks and find out and talk to those managers about how it really is. And a lot of times, like Dennis said, some are using paper. I get, when I came onto a new position years ago, I got, oh, yeah, we've got technology. We use Excel to do it. And basically, they were just typing in the names and the shifts. There was no automation. And to me, you might as well be chiseling it on a stone or writing it on paper at that point, right? Because it's going to change just as quickly. Without the automation piece, a software to think for you and to put your rules in place, I think it becomes even more difficult. And from my standpoint, a small story, when I was a hall director living in the building with the students as a professional, master's level professional, I had a huge staff of RAs, not huge, I had a staff of about a dozen. resident assistants, and we had to have one on duty every night on call. And we would, like Dennis, I think, alluded to in a previous question, we would set that up at the beginning of the semester for the entire semester. But that scheduling, I needed one person per night. That took over 3 hours to do with 12 people. And it was almost like a fantasy football draft, if anyone knows what I'm talking about, where everyone draws a number, that's your order, and then you snake back. So if you have 12, then you're also 13, and it snakes back around. And so, but it took 3 hours to do. And to me, that's not a good use of time. That's not a good use of anyone's time to kind of do that. There's a better way to automate it and to take people's schedules into consideration. And so that was my experience prior. I'll reiterate a few things that Dennis said, but he was right on. The automation piece is huge. First of all, like it says on the screen there, it modernizes your scheduling to be in 2019, where a lot of our workers, frontline workers, almost everyone has a smartphone, right? And even our students have smartphones, and they're very accustomed to it. So even if you could get a scheduling system that also works on a mobile platform, is even better, because that's what our students are used to. That's what this generation is used to, and it provides that fairness and the flexibility that you see on the screen. The flexibility that I love is the shift swapping, and the ability that if I have a test that I need to study for and I need a little extra study time, that I could throw it out there as a shift swap and see if someone will take it, as opposed to calling my manager and putting it on them, right, with a vacant shift. Or if my manager tells me, well, you got to find a replacement, and now I have to call everyone I work with or text them or email them. And so there's a lot of time being wasted depending on who has that responsibility. And if you can't find someone, this isn't the student's career, so they're just not going to show up because academics are their priority. And so I think from my perspective, the experience gets easier when you can automate it, and it takes the time off the manager. A lot of the change management piece that I hear from managers is, this is the way we've always done it, so they don't want to change. Or two, maybe they don't have the skill set, or they're nervous about using a new platform. And that's a training issue. That's a communication issue, I think, from a housing and dining perspective on, are you providing the adequate training, the support that's needed for that person? Because a lot of folks don't want to take on these initiatives because they're just not used to it. But the generations coming up are very much used to change and technology, and so that's the places public sector or private sector is going, and public sector should be following, especially because we're institutions of higher education, and the research that's happening at all of your institutions are innovative, groundbreaking, but yet we're still doing schedules on paper, right? That to me, that blows my mind.
Yeah. The focus of this webinar in particular is on scheduling, but I know that an automated workforce solution can help with so much more than scheduling. Chris, can you just briefly touch on some of the other aspects that you found useful before we move on?
Yeah, outside the scheduling piece, I mean, you can talk payroll, but what I really love from an HR standpoint, from how do you build a great culture at a university or in a department or in a division, is, especially in student affairs, where it's a lot about relationships, and a lot of the housing and dining areas are either situated in student affairs or work jointly with student affairs, is the recruitment and the onboarding. The ability to allow students to apply on their mobile phone for a job is wonderful. That's where most jobs are being applied for nowadays. Two, the onboarding piece of this, once they're hired, you can automate the onboarding so that they have just a wonderful experience. And for a lot of folks, for a lot of our student employees, it's their first experience with a job anyway. I mean, I couldn't tell you, as director of HR, how many times you ask your employees to bring in their I-9 IDs and things like that. And and they would get there, they'd have maybe their license, and then the payroll person would ask for, hey, what about your Social Security? And they go, give me a minute. And they would have to get on their phone and call mom and say, Mom, where's my Social Security card? Like they'd never seen it. And so how do you get ahead of that through automation? So with onboarding, you could have sent them an email saying, hey, you're going to need these types of verifications. Here's some training we want you to go through. Oh, by the way, here's a welcome letter or a video from our director welcoming you to as an employee. And this goes for students or for full-time employees. We have to build that culture, and automation can help unburden a lot of HR tasks and tactical tasks, so that administrators can now spend time more strategically with their employees or helping them get ramped up.
Yeah.
Yeah, Chris.
Sorry, go ahead, Dennis.
Yeah, I was going to say, Chris, you made some excellent points, and since you talked about the strategic value, I'd like to offer one tactical example. I could come up with several, but let me offer one tactical example that we experienced here, and that's with address changes. Before we had automation and employee self-service, we had papers flying all over the place because student workers, especially student workers, they often move a lot. You know, they may move 2 or 3 times, 4 times, 6 times a year. And the old process was a person would have to go to the website, print off a form, fill it out, send it in intercompany mail. It would come to the HR or the payroll department, and at some point we would process it. Well, that might take a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. And what's happened in the process is a payroll cycle's been run. So now the check that person just worked for doesn't show up. And it might be an $80 check or $150 check. And students are living on that money. They need that money today. So now the worker comes in, the student comes in and says, hey, today's payroll, yesterday was payroll, I didn't get my check. And we find out we mailed it to the wrong address. So now the payroll team has to void out that check, reissue it. And at a point in time, we had extra people in payroll just and only just to facilitate that manual process. That's it. So aside from the benefits to the HR, the payroll department, that in that particular example, the stress caused to a person that's waiting on their paycheck to arrive in the mail, and it's not actually going to arrive. And if it does, it's not going to be for a week or two because it has to go through the postal system. And sometimes it never arrives, by the way. And the stress it causes that individual and the impact it has to their ability to study and stay focused when, you know, they need their money. Once we solved the automation problem with that, I have to tell you, the number of people in the payroll department shrunk just because we didn't have to do that work anymore. And oh, by the way, the students have benefited from it greatly. Of course, the people here today don't know any of those things happen because the automation's been in place for a while and it works very, very well. But that's more of a tactical example. But it's absolutely real and it's impactful both for the worker and for the HR and payroll operation.
Well, Dennis, because of the way the process was before, it was a real waste of time and resources for both the student and the team. And I'll do a one sentence one, but from a full-time employee standpoint, the self-service that we can now offer them, even from benefits. I have 4 kiddos, and every time I've had one, I've had to physically go in to the university to provide my proof that I had a child, so as a qualifying event, so that they could get benefits. Now, with automation and technology the way it is, I could sit here in my house holding my baby in my arms and take a picture with my phone and upload it now. And I don't even have to take the time to go in to the university. Talk about self-service and taking care of your employees, right? Now I can spend that time with my child, with my family, where I should be spending my time.
That's great. Thank you both. So to just quickly sum up here before we get to questions from the audience, there's a number of challenges involved in scheduling for complex campus environments like dining, housing, and security. Many of these involve the use of student employees who have incredibly busy schedules. They often have to call out of shifts at the last minute, and having some sort of automated solution and self-service solution really takes a lot of the burden off of campus managers and empowers students to help fill their own shifts, swap shifts, juggle their schedules around, and so on. Just ensuring that services have proper coverage. Before we get into the Q&A, I'd just like to ask both of our presenters if you have any final thoughts or words of advice for your colleagues at other institutions as they wrestle with these issues. Maybe a minute or two for each of you. Dennis, why don't you go first?
The only real thought that I have is if automation is not in place today, or if you happen to have automation but you're using multiple systems, try to abandon that model. Try to find a system that's a single system that encompasses timekeeping, HR, and payroll. Now I know that sounds easy, but I can tell you it's well worth the long-term benefits, because now you have a single database with all the employee data in it, and the processes that flow from that are going to reap not just operational rewards for you, operational rewards for the employees and customers, but it's also going to save you money over time. So if you're thinking about improving processes and systems, start from that level and then try to justify having multiple systems interacting or interfacing with each other. And you'll go right back to the first model and try to convince yourself. Take my word for it if you want, but I guarantee you it will save you money in the long term.
Dennis, and especially if you're on premises with your solutions, right? If you're keeping up your own servers, right? Nowadays, everything's in the cloud. You can save quite a bit of money just by going to the cloud alone.
If you have a single platform. It's hard to go to the cloud if you have multiple platforms.
Agreed. Yep. I think for me, my takeaway is I totally understand. My PhD is in higher education, student affairs leadership. So I totally understand the purpose and the mission of a university is student success. That is by far the mission of our universities and campuses. But I would love to challenge higher education to, right, just consider your employees' experience, not just the climate, but what is the experience they're having, and include your students, right? Because what your employees, how they feel, that will reap its benefits to the students. If you're taking care of your employees, they will take care of your students. And some of that way is for sure technology and automation. And scheduling is a really good example of this in a vacuum, really. It's a good example of the larger institution. But one that can be solved and then create that margin to do other things.
Okay. Thank you both very much. You've given participants a lot to think about. As we get to questions from our audience, I'd like to remind everybody that it's not too late to submit a question for Dennis or Chris. If you have anything that you'd like to ask, please do so by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. First question, it alludes to something that one of you mentioned, Dennis, I think it was you earlier, about empowering employees to find their own replacements and swap shifts and so on requires letting go of some control on the part of managers. What has been your experience with that? Have you found some managers are resistant to that idea? And if so, how do you encourage them to give up some of that control?
That's a great question. Well, first of all, Dennis, it's much easier said than done. The experiences we've had is it's like any other change management process. If you want someone to modify their behavior a little bit, you have to show them how it's going to value them. And that's where I like to begin the thought process. And when you think about scheduling in the overall context of work, it's a pretty routine, mundane task, right? You're just looking at a clock and putting people in spaces. And if you can convince a manager that they actually could spend that time on something more valuable to the organization, more productive, in fact, maybe even something that requires more skills, which could possibly allow them to earn more money, if you can tap into that thought process, that will start to thinking for that manager to say, well, I guess I don't really need to approve it, because at the end of the day, sure, I'm sure managers, they have their favorite team members. They have people that they prefer over people that, well, maybe not. So-and-so is usually late, and they're not really engaged when they're here, and whatever other reasons they have. But at the end of the day, what they need is a person to fill a role. And if that person is still on the schedule, why not let technology do the heavy lifting, reduce the amount of time you need to do those mundane tasks, assuming, of course, that you have a full staff of people when you need them with the skills you need. If you can accomplish that with tools instead of a piece of paper and a pencil with a big fat eraser on it, you're going to have a lot of time available to do those things that are really probably more fun, more rewarding, and certainly more valuable to the organization. And if I can tap into that particular mindset, then I guarantee you the manager will have changed and at least experimented with it, at least got comfortable with giving up that control. And if you can't convince them that it's valuable to them, they're not going to change.
Yeah, I'll jump in here. Dennis, I'm with you on this one. It's the what's in it for me from a manager perspective, right? And you can really get away from, or you can, so what Dennis was talking about with the managers, and they may have their favorites, right? We're talking about bias here. And there could be some bias that you, from a risk standpoint, from an HR standpoint, I wouldn't want to have, right, from a manager's perspective. And so I would want to get rid of that as well. And I think trying to let managers know that these are some of the reasons, but then also, I love what you said, Dennis, about they can do other things. Maybe they can increase their skill set. I also would rather have my managers, instead of doing a schedule, actually managing people. I mean, it's a novel idea, but I would love for them to be with the employees, coaching them up, and spending time with the employees, actually managing them, as opposed to pushing a schedule.
Yeah, Chris, I couldn't agree more. I think that's exactly what we've experienced here, and it's actually pretty simple when you think about it. But again, it's much easier to talk about than to actually do, because it does require the manager to give a little control away, not a lot, just a little. And once they get
could have had
comfortable
for 20 years, right?
Exactly. Exactly right.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'd like to address another question that came in from a participant. You've spoken a lot about student scheduling. Do you have any experience in scheduling and tracking time of individuals who work in a research environment under an individual investigators or under certain grant programs? Can you talk about that and how an automated solution can help with that as well?
Chris, did you want to go first, or do you want me to take this?
Go ahead, Dennis. I'll piggyback off you.
Okay. The answer to the question is I certainly have experienced that. We have sponsored programs at our campus. We do the administration for those. It represents about 25% of our workforce. So we do have that exact scenario where we have PIs have student workers, whether they're doing research or even not even research. Maybe they're just providing administrative support. But the research component of it is actually fairly complicated from a scheduling standpoint, because faculty working on research, they get money, a grant usually from a federal agency, and they have a finite amount of money in that grant to pay those student workers, and they still have to get their research done. So in that context, it's very challenging from a scheduling standpoint, but the tool that we found most useful is not so much the scheduler, because usually there's one or two, maybe three students working for a faculty member doing that research. What we found useful is mobile for timekeeping. And that's the tool that we have really seen help our PIs manage that workload. Not so much as scheduling, because in that particular scenario, most of our PIs are very, very close to our students. Some of those students actually attend coursework with the faculty. So there's a whole different connection there between that particular environment, that student, and that manager, in a sense, than we might see in dining. But from a scheduling standpoint, I haven't experienced any real problems with our research group, because they're just the PI are just much closer to the students as a rule. I mean, not 100%, but as a rule. So that's what we've experienced.
Yeah, and I've seen this on. I haven't actually done it with the research, but I've seen it on like maybe the facility side where you can charge to a specific job, and they can clock in mobily. So it can be done from a researcher's perspective, from a PI perspective, but then also from like a facility side where they may be going to different facilities, and then you can charge to a certain project because the facilities folks are all over the place working on many different issues, and so you can then charge per program or project, and so it certainly can work and be automated.
Okay, thanks. We're getting close to our time limit here, but I want to sneak in one more question about integration. Chris, I'll direct this to you, but Dennis, feel free to weigh in as well if you have any thoughts. We have some people asking about the integration of Kronos with other systems like Student Information System or ERPs and so on.
The simple answer is yes. It would depend. Some of it depends on what you're using, what you're integrating with, but for the most part, Kronos integrates with all the major ERPs out there, HR softwares, payroll, and have done it in the past. There's some new technology with Kronos's Workforce Dimensions where it's an open framework, so there are lots of APIs and partners like Microsoft and Facebook. There's a lot of those things, but certainly can do the ERP piece. Dennis, I don't know which you've worked with specifically, but maybe you have an answer to this one as well.
Other than what Chris talked about, I don't really have anything to add, quite frankly. I think Chris answered it quite well.
Okay, great. Thank you both. I'm going to wrap things up now, but if anybody submitted a question that we didn't get to in the Q&A portion, somebody from Kronos will follow up with you directly. And if anybody has any other thoughts or questions about anything you heard today, maybe over the next few days as you let all of this sink in, I'd encourage you to reach out to Kronos by going to their website, which is kronos.com. So I'd like to thank our presenters today, Dennis Miller and Chris Mullen, for a very informative presentation. And I'd like to thank all of the audience members for joining us today as well. Hopefully you gained some good insight that will help you solve the scheduling challenges that you face on your own campuses. As a reminder, you'll receive an email message within the next few days that contains a link to this recording along with the slides. Kronos will also be issuing a white paper on this topic as well. You can watch for that in the next few weeks at either the Kronos or eCampus News websites. So thanks again to everybody for participating, and have a great day.
Thank you, Dennis. Thank you, Chris.
Yep, thank you both. Appreciate it.